From Chicago studios, this is the Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum, I'm Samana, Siddiqui. First, the headlines. Thousands of demonstrators in D.C. demand economic justice. America celebrates the first national Juneteenth. 8 million affected by monsoon flooding in Bangladesh and India. Al-Azhar calls for enacting law criminalizing Islamophobia. Jazeera publishes image of bullet that killed journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. Thousands of Rohingya rally in Bangladesh to demand safe return to Burma. Our top story tonight. On Saturday, advocacy groups and thousands of people from low-income communities gathered in Washington, D.C. to demand policymakers fight poverty, not the poor. The demonstration was led by the Poor People's Campaign. The Reverend Dr. Liz Theo-Harris, co-chair of the campaign, said we are the 140 million poor and low-wealth people who won't be silent anymore. Campaign co-chair Bishop William Barber echoed that message in a speech at the Mass Poor People's and Low-Wage Workers Assembly and Moral March. Barber spoke against essential workers being treated like they are expendable during a public health crisis and federal lawmakers blocking pandemic relief for families. He also called out the stealing of native lands and unjust immigration and said millions of people nationwide are facing hunger and homelessness. Abdul Muzakir was convicted of killing a 24-year-old journalist as a group of Hanafi Muslims took hostages during the 1977 takeover of D.C. government buildings. In April, Muzakir, now 67, was ordered released as part of an effort to let out inmates who have served at least 20 years. That's once it is determined they are not a danger to society and might be particularly susceptible to the pandemic because of age or health conditions. A dozen Hanafi Muslims held 149 hostages captive in 3 downtown buildings between March 9th and 11th, 1977. Maurice Williams was a news reporter for Howard University's WHUR-FM radio. He was shot to death during the hostage crisis. A judge later sentenced Muzakir to more than 7 decades in prison. On June 19, 1865, Union Army Major General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas 2 months after the Civil War ended. This was to proclaim more than 250,000 enslaved people in Texas were free. President Abraham Lincoln had freed all enslaved people 2.5 years earlier with the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. But Texas never fell to Union troops in battle, and black people there remained in bondage until the day now commemorated as Juneteenth. Black Texans have marked the day each year since, with parades and picnics, music, and fine clothes. Juneteenth gained momentum over the years, but only last summer was it declared a national holiday. In international news today, 8 million people have been affected by historic flooding in Bangladesh and India that has left 75 people dead. Trains have been flipped by landslides, and a lack of telecommunications services has made it difficult to fully assess the extent of the damage. The Bangladesh Red Crescent Society aims to help with resettlement efforts. The organization wrote on Twitter it will provide cash assistance to the flood-affected families. A 2018 report by investment bank Morgan Stanley found 23,000 Indian millionaires had left the country since 2014. A recent Global Wealth Migration Review report revealed nearly 5,000 millionaires, or 2% of all high net worth people in India, left the country in 2020 alone. Bob Dylan, Canadian Indian real estate magnate and chief executive officer of Main Street Equity Corp., views this as the third wave of migration from India. The first wave came when poor and marginal farmers from Punjab moved to Western countries over a century ago. Later, professionals left India in search of better working and living conditions. The Muslim Media Watch Group of Nigeria applauded the Supreme Court judgment on female Muslim students wearing hijab in public schools in the country's largest city, Lagos. Group National Coordinator Alhaji Ibrahim Abdullahi called the court's ruling a landmark judgment that would restore sanity, peace, and progress in the education system. Ibrahim said some opponents of hijab in public schools based their argument on the tradition and culture of their faith or that of the founders of their schools. He likened the hijab to the uniform put on by Catholic nuns. He added the ban on hijab was highly discriminatory to Muslims and a violation of their fundamental human rights. A new film depicts 2 different periods of war during which Bosnian Muslims saved Jews from Nazis, and 50 years later, Jews rescued Muslims from Serbian extremists. U.S.-based film director Sabina Vairacha, who fled Bosnia during the war in the 1990s, said she wants her film to remind the world of the goodness of ordinary people. Vairacha's script won the Holocaust Film Contest held in May by the Claims Conference, a Jewish organization which secures compensation for Holocaust survivors. The film Sevap Mitzvah, A Good Deed, is based on the true story of a Muslim woman, Zainab Hardaja, and her family who hid a Jewish family in their home. Hardaj's family risked their own lives to help the Kabilio family escape the Nazi-occupied Bosnian capital Sarajevo in the 1940s and move to Israel. 50 years later, during the 1992-95 siege of Sarajevo, the Jewish community helped the Hardajas leave Sarajevo, and the Kabilio family secured them a refuge in Israel. Al-Azhar University calls for enacting a law criminalizing Islamophobia. Details after this short break, so stay tuned, and we'll be right back after these messages.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize, and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes.
There are 16 million children struggling with hunger in America. That's 1 in 5 daughters, sons, neighbors, and classmates who don't know where their next meal is coming from. Yet billions of pounds of good food go to waste every year. It's time we do something about it. Feeding America is a nationwide network of food banks that helps provide meals to millions of kids and families in need. Visit feedingamerica.org to help them feed even more. Together, we can solve hunger. Together, we're feeding America.
Mr. Speaker, if I decide to wear a turban, or you decide to wear a cross, or he decides to wear a kippah or a skull cap, or she decides to wear a hijab or a burqa, does that mean that it is open season for right honourable members of this House to make derogatory and divisive remarks about our appearance? For those of us who from a young age have had to endure and face up to being called names such as Towelhead or Taliban, or coming from Bongo land, we can appreciate full well the hurt and pain felt by already vulnerable Muslim women when they are described as looking like bank robbers and letterboxes. So rather than hide behind sham and whitewash investigations, when will the Prime Minister finally apologise for his derogatory and racist remarks? Racist remarks, Mr. Speaker, which have led to a spike in hate crime. And given the increasing prevalence of such incidents within his party, when will the Prime Minister finally order an inquiry into Islamophobia within the Conservative Party, something which he and his Chancellor promised on national television?
Despite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, millions around the world will not have access. We need a vaccine that's free and available to everyone, everywhere. It's time for a people's vaccine.
Assalamu alaikum! Open up your eyes.
Assalamu alaikum everyone, it's your brother Zain Bika from South Africa. One of the first educational programs ever produced for Muslim children was the ever-popular Adam's World series. The colorful and comical Muslim puppets stole the heart of a generation. Sound Vision will be releasing brand new episodes of Adam's World with the launch of a Adam's World app. Subscribers will enjoy new Adam's World episodes as they are released, as well as all the classic episodes of Adam's World. So visit adamsworldapp.com now to learn more, subscribe and enjoy new adventures of Adam and his friends. And let's keep helping tomorrow's Muslims today. Assalamu alaikum.
Adam's World. Believe me, there's a lot to see. Bismillah. Let's explore.
To stop this genocide, we need your help.
Welcome back. Al-Azhar University, the top Sunni Islamic institution in the world, is calling for enacting a new law to protect mosques and confront Islamophobia. The Al-Azhar Observatory for Combating Extremism said there is an urgent need to enact a new law guaranteeing protection of mosques and criminalizing Islamophobia. This call comes amid rising hate speech against Islam and Muslims in many European countries, the observatory said. The Norwegian Brandelige organization issued a report about crimes of discrimination. It revealed 768 recorded attacks against mosques in Germany between 2014 and 2021. In the first quarter of 2022, 83 cases of hostility against Islam were recorded. The International Union for Muslim Scholars has called for enacting a law to ban insults against religions and sanctities. The Qatar-based group said it will dispatch a delegation of Muslim scholars to Islamic countries for talks on the rise of insults targeting Islam. The union said it will ask the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and the United Nations to push for drafting legislation to ban insults against religious sanctities. The anger has been rising within the Islamic world over comments made by a spokesperson for India's ruling Bharatiya Janata Party against Prophet Muhammad last month. The incident prompted Qatar, Kuwait, and Iran to summon their Indian envoys to protest insults against the Prophet. Al Jazeera network has published a photo of a bullet it said killed its veteran correspondent in Palestine. Shireen Abu Akleh was shot on May 11th while covering a raid in the occupied West Bank. An investigation conducted by the media network and published on its website said the green-tipped bullet was designed to pierce armor and is used in an M4 rifle. The network said the bullet was analyzed using 3D models. According to experts, it was a 5.56 millimeter caliber, the same used by Israeli forces. Al Jazeera cited experts who determined the bullet was designed and manufactured in the United States. On Sunday, thousands of Rohingyas living in refugee camps in Bangladesh's southeast coast of Cox's Bazar held rallies calling for their safe return to Burma. They sought help from the international community to gain their citizenship rights. Rohingya refugees gathered in the Ukhiya and Taknaf camps and held simultaneous protests early in the morning. Organizer Ansar Ali told Andalu Agency the rallies were held on the eve of World Refugee Day to let the world know that we want to return to our homeland. He asked the international community to take immediate action to aid their sustainable repatriation. Rohingya are the most persecuted minority in the world, according to the UN. They fled Burma after a brutal military crackdown by the Burmese military in August 2017, which many have described as a genocide. An Afghan citizen has turned his home into a school in the southern province of Afghanistan after village schools were destroyed during 20 years of war. 29-year-old Najibullah Ishaq of Tulakan village, about 24 miles from the provincial capital Kandahar, volunteers to help children with their studies. According to a UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs report, 7.9 million school-age Afghan children face great challenges accessing educational opportunities. Afghan children have little chance of attending school to get an education. Decades of armed conflict, political crises, and depressing economic conditions have wiped out the education system. Following attacks on Black Muslim women in the Canadian city of Edmonton, a new initiative aims to make women feel safe while out and about in the city. Edmonton Safewalk is a new program by Sisters Dialogue, a grassroots organization providing culturally safe spaces and support for Muslim women and girls. It offers a buddy system for Muslim women, especially Black women, when they are walking around or running errands in the city. Aisha Ali, board member at Sisters Dialogue, said people are safer in numbers. Ali said the program was created in response to the attacks on Black Muslim women over several years. Coming up next after the break is our in-depth analysis segment, so stay tuned, and we'll be right back after these messages.
I am what hunger looks like in America.
When we adopt a shelter pet, we discover they're a unique mix of all kinds of things.
There it is. Keep going with it. Leo!
They're a little bit of a lot of things, but they're all pure love.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes.
Mr. Speaker, if I decide to wear a turban, or you decide to wear a cross, or he decides to wear a kippah or a skull cap, or she decides to wear a hijab or a burqa, does that mean that it is open season for right honourable members of this House to make derogatory and divisive remarks about our appearance? For those of us who from a young age have had to endure and face up to being called names such as Towelhead or Taliban, or coming from Bongo land, we can appreciate full well the hurt and pain felt by already vulnerable Muslim women when they are described as looking like bank robbers and letterboxes. So rather than and hide behind sham and whitewash investigations? When will the Prime Minister finally apologise for his derogatory and racist remarks? Racist remarks, Mr. Speaker, which have led to a spike in hate crime. And given the increasing prevalence of such incidents within his party, when will the Prime Minister finally order an inquiry into Islamophobia within the Conservative Party, something which he and his Chancellor promised on national television?
Despite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, millions around the world will not have access. We need a vaccine that's free and available to everyone, everywhere. It's time for a people's vaccine.
Dad, they took over my bedroom. Come on, come on. Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3. Dad! You saved me. Dad?
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
We are Justice for All. Headquartered in the heart of downtown Chicago, Justice for All is a global humanitarian initiative dedicated to raising awareness for human rights concerns impacting vulnerable minority groups. Our diverse team of staff and volunteers, led by Imam Malik Mujahid, work tirelessly to help Justice for All achieve their goals. We promote policies that protect religious freedom, address the root causes of mass displacement, and recognize the plight of refugees and forced migrants. Together, we can continue to stand up for justice. Justice for all.
Welcome back. To talk about the situation of refugees around the globe on this World Refugee Day, let's go to Imam Abdul Malik Mujahid. Over to you, Imam Mujahid.
Thank you, Samana. World Refugee Day is being observed, but is the world really concerned about refugees? Why world continue to produce more and more refugees? Can something be done to take care of the existing refugees and return back to their homes? Yesterday, there was a huge demonstration in Bangladeshi refugee camps of Rohingyas. It cannot be called a refugee camp because this is almost like a detention camp. I have been around barbed wire. They cannot go in and out. They cannot have education beyond 3rd grade and things like that. So they want to go back to their homes. What is the future for refugees? We have with us someone who is connected with the United Nations, President and CEO of United Nations Association in Canada, Jaime Webbe. Welcome to Muslim Network TV.
Thank you so much for having me on today.
How many refugees are there now?
Oh, millions. And unfortunately, the number just keeps growing every year. And we don't see any signs that the flow of refugees is going to slow and certainly not stop and reverse. And it's one of those trends in the globe that we have just not given enough attention to addressing, that we just continue to ignore. We deal with the problem, but we are not yet at the stage of dealing with the root causes, the issues that drive refugees to flee their homes.
So there are, according to different numbers, UN numbers, before Ukraine was 84 million, and now Ukraine probably has added 4-6 million more people who are out of their homes. A good number of them are refugees. You were mentioning we are not paying enough attention to making sure that more refugees are not produced. But let me ask you this question. World Refugee Day, who is marking that, and what are the goals of that particular day?
I think it's important, first of all, to note that that number, 84 million, doesn't include refugees who are waiting to have their cases heard. So those that are not yet classified as refugees, but are asylum seekers waiting to see whether they're given refugee status. So the number is actually quite a bit higher. We are certainly seeing UN agencies around the world commemorating this day. The issue of refugees is a very, very difficult one that requires careful political negotiations at all levels, both in terms of understanding who is a refugee and where they're coming from, but also when they're arriving, the kind of support that they're going to be receiving, the acknowledgement that they're going to be receiving by the countries that they're seeking asylum in. You mentioned the refugee camps. Refugee camps are only one situation that face refugees, and it's how a number of countries do deal with refugees when they come to their shores. But there's a number of other countries that have very strong refugee integration programs where they're looking at how refugees can be supported to continue what would be a normal day-to-day life, including things like getting children back into schools, getting refugees back into work, into their communities. And those are the countries that you're seeing really marking Refugee Day with the acknowledgement of the work that their communities, their governments have done to support refugees over the courses of many, many years.
Tell us, what is producing these refugees?
Largely global instability, and we're seeing that instability being driven by a number of factors. The first and most obvious is, of course, internal conflict and war. We're seeing ongoing wars. The UN right now has 17 active peacekeeping missions where they're trying to bring stability back to situations. But beyond the human conflict, we're also seeing climate refugees. We're seeing a number of people whose lives and livelihoods are just no longer supported because they are not getting enough rain, or the temperatures are increasing too much. Agricultural land is becoming unproductive. And so the only way that people have to support their families is being taken away from them due to global climate crises. While we're addressing these crises from an environmental perspective, from an economic perspective, we're not looking sufficiently at the human impact of both human conflict as well as climate change and environmental degradation.
Now, Rohingya refugees, they're not allowed to study beyond a third grade level. Rohingya teachers are there, they want to teach, but their schools are shut down. Why countries will resist something basic like education? I mean, if they are staying in Bangladesh, they are good for Bangladesh. If they go back to Burma, they are good for Burma. And it is definitely good for these people. So what United Nations can do to ensure that something as beneficial as education is allowed?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And the way that the UN works with host countries is through a very, very complicated series of negotiations where they talk to host countries about preserving the human rights of refugees. And not providing education beyond third grade is actually a violation of human rights. So the UN will be working actively to ensure that human rights are applied universally, regardless to somebody's status within a specific country. But violations of human rights do happen a lot, and refugees are particularly vulnerable and tend to be more exposed to violations of human rights than many other populations. All the UN can do is investigate accord and make sure that those who are committing these such human rights are held accountable, and that there is global support to ensure that the human rights of refugees, especially refugee children, are preserved regardless of where they are and the situation in which they're living in. But absolutely denying children access to education is a clear violation of human rights, and the human rights of refugees are protected under the United Nations Charter.
Now, because of the Ukraine refugees, we know that most of these refugees are women and children. That's the case for most of the refugees around the world?
Women and children tend to be amongst the most vulnerable of refugees, but you do see, depending on what's driving the refugee crisis in the country of origin, a very, very different makeup in refugee populations depending on the country that people are coming from. What we happen to see, for example, from sub-Saharan Africa is a high number of refugee males in the 18 to 25 range. So you're seeing adolescent and early career males making up a large portion of the refugee population from some countries. So it's very, very difficult to be able to characterize one group and say that this is the profile of a refugee. It's very different. Ukraine, absolutely, it's largely women and children, but in other cases, it's largely adolescent males. And in other cases, we're seeing a large number of families that are seeking asylum and refugee status.
Which country, not counting the Western Hemisphere, is taking care of refugees in a better way?
That's a very, very difficult question that you've asked me. I myself happen to live in Kenya for about 3 years. And when I was in Kenya, I was working quite closely with those that were supporting the refugee camps in northern Kenya. They are doing a better job of providing basic services, including education, sanitation, etc., to refugees. But they're getting a lot of support. There was a lot of support for the Kenyan government, who were a willing partner in providing appropriate services for refugees. So we do see some good examples like Kenya of governments that are stepping up and making sure that the rights of refugees are guaranteed, but they cannot be doing it alone. A refugee crisis is a significant burden on countries that may have limited economic ability to respond to that crisis. And that's why the UN and the global community needs to look at the refugee crisis as a global issue that requires a global response.
What the United Nations is doing to educate people at larger level, because refugees are facing resistance in many countries. It has given rise to right-wing extremism. So it seems the world is going to be slightly more difficult for refugees. So what can be done to change the heart of people like that?
Yeah, for that, the UN tends to work with local organizations, local governments, local nonprofit organizations to provide them with the resources needed to reach out directly to the community. What we've seen is that message coming from the UN or coming from a national government doesn't necessarily resonate with communities that are dealing with a large influx of refugees. Whereas if you have organizations on the ground that are able to speak to people within their own community and say, this is what the experience of a refugee is like, this is what it means for a refugee to come to this community, to come into our community, that resonates much more strongly. So the UN never works in isolation. It always works in partnership. And when it comes to creating a better understanding of refugees, the local organizations are absolutely the best place to provide that messaging. And they're receiving support from the UN in terms of both political support as well as in developing some of that messaging, some of that communication material, etc. Here in Canada, the Canadian Office for UNHCR recently launched a photo campaign, and the photo exhibit is traveling around to a variety of cities in Canada to say, this is the face of a climate refugee. This is the experience. This is the story of a climate refugee. So they're providing this very tangible, very physical, experiential material, and then working with local partners to get that message out.
I heard in the news today that United Nations is reducing the ration being provided to those in need because of the food shortage, and especially the grain shortage. But grain is sitting in Russia and Ukraine, war zones. Is there a possibility that United Nations, being a not involved party in that, can lift that grain because different countries are blocking export of their grain? So how are you going to handle providing food to so many refugees while supplies are difficult to get?
Yeah, countries give to refugee operations in two ways. The first is through cash, and the second is through providing material and food. And what we're seeing is that a lot of the countries that used to provide direct food aids, they would give you American wheat or American grain, are reducing the amount that they're giving in anticipation of a global grain shortage. So it's not just about getting grain out of countries where it's sitting in silos and not able to be moved. It's also a question of being able to reassure the world that that countries are safe in giving up some of their own supplies and should not be restricting the support that they provide to UN refugee agencies. I happen to know of two efforts to provide farmers in the Ukraine with on-farm storage for grain, because the issue is not necessarily that the grain and wheat is not being grown, but it's no longer being transported to large distribution centers. So there are a couple of two projects that I know of that are working directly with Ukraine farmers to secure that supply, to make sure that the grain is dried and treated and stored in a smaller scale. And we do expect that that's going to see benefits for this harvest. It has to. It has to, otherwise the harvest will be lost. So it is happening. There's not a lot of news coverage of the efforts that are going on to support Ukrainian farmers in preserving and distributing their grain, but it's happening.
Well, thank you so much, Jaime Webb, for your work. Refugees are not forgotten people. Someone is working on it, and Jaime Webb is one of those people, President and CEO of the United Nations Association in Canada. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Back to you, Samana.
Thank you, Imam Mujahid. That's all from our Chicago studios tonight. Thank you for tuning in. You can find previous episodes and more on our YouTube or Facebook. For more content, keep watching Muslim Network TV or visit muslimnetwork.tv. Salam and good night.